the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rose by 40% in the 20th and 21st century. This level of carbon dioxide is higher than any other time in the past 800,000 years.
The 5 years from 2015 to 2019 were the 5 hottest years on record, and 2010 to 2019 was the hottest decade since records began.
Global sea levels rose about 8 inches in the last century. The rate in the last 2 decades, however, is nearly double that of the last century, and it is accelerating slightly every year.
8 million metric tons. That's how much plastic we dump into the oceans each year. By 2050, ocean plastic will outweigh all of the ocean's fish. There's so much junk in the sea, the debris has formed giant garbage patches. There are 5 of them around the world, and the largest, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, includes an estimated 1.8 trillion pieces of trash and covers an area twice the size of Texas.
We are blessed in Scotland to rarely be all that far from wonderful scenery and vistas just like this one behind me out by Loch Artlet. It's stunning, incredible environments to explore and discover the wonder that God has made in our world around us. To be filled with awe at the beauty that God has placed in our world. And there's an important conversation that we, particularly as Christians, need to have about the impact that we as humans are having on this world, the negative impact that we are having. The conversation of the environment has thankfully become one that's much more commonplace in our day-to-day lives, where people are reflecting more and more on what impact they have and how best to minimize it. But I think there's a valuable conversation for us as Christians to have, to look at Scripture, to reflect on what we are taught and shown by God, and to consider how that pairs with our impacts on the world around us, and particularly on that of the climate and the environment. But it can be a difficult topic for us to look at when it comes to Scripture, and that's purely because Scripture doesn't really address it directly all that often. There's occasionally little mentions to be found which are maybe imply something, but often in context maybe go a different direction. For example, in Numbers 35, it talks about the land being polluted. Do not pollute the land around you. And at first you're like, oh, that could be a great way to go to explore the environment. But when you look at it deeper, it's talking about blood being spilled. Blood is the pollutant in those verses, and it's about not murdering other people. It's about how we respond and kind of look after others around us, not being violent or murdering or things like that. And so we don't want to come to Scripture and lift it out of context to simply use it for the things that we care about. We have lenses, we have bias as we look on the world, and we can't make Scripture say something that it doesn't. We shouldn't as Christians. We need to look at it honestly, to reflect on what it says, and then to take that and apply that to the world around us. Now, that's not to say that Scripture has nothing to say about the environment. We're going to be exploring the very topic today, but that we need to be careful and cautious as we approach Scripture to not try and force it to say something that it doesn't. Because of course Scripture doesn't say all that much about human impact on the environment. These are books written thousands upon thousands of years ago, where human impact on the world around them was much more limited. The population was much, much smaller. There was no kind of extensive burning of fossil fuels going up into the atmosphere. There were no plastics being made to be discarded in landfill or in the ocean. These simply weren't factors in the world around them. So of course Scripture says nothing about the things that, when those writing it, didn't have any reference or knowledge of. So we need to be aware of what it does say, but be aware of the world around us and the challenges and the problems and the realities that we face, and consider how the two pair together. And I think this is particularly important for us to hear those of older generations in church, because it is one that is so important to many of our young people. There was a really interesting study done by Youthscape and Tear Fund called Burning Down the House, where they surveyed and asked questions of many young people. And one of the kind of statistics that came out of that was that 9 out of 10 young people really care and are invested in the impact that we're having on the environment. But 1 in 10 thought the church was doing enough to respond to that need and to that crisis. That has to be a challenge for us as church and as Christians to reflect on our actions. And today, as we go through our little video series, you might notice that we don't have any skits in this one. We felt like this wasn't really the topic for light-hearted skits so much. But it's also one of the topics that I think we have the most recorded voices of young people yet. Hear that. Hear what they are saying in that as they share some of the facts, the scary facts that we have gathered that are from a variety of scientists.
The poorest half of the global population are responsible for only around 10% of global emissions, yet live overwhelmingly in the countries most vulnerable to climate change. While the richest 10% of people in the world are responsible for around 50% of global emissions.
11% of the world's population, or 800 million people, are currently living vulnerable to climate change impacts such as droughts, floods, heatwaves, extreme weather events and sea level rise.
As global temperatures and sea levels rise, as the oceans acidify and precipitation patterns get rearranged, people living in poverty are the most severely impacted. Since climate change affects everything from where a person can live to their access to healthcare, millions of people could be plunged further into poverty as environmental conditions worsen.
An estimated 100 million people living in developing countries could be pushed into poverty by climate change by 2030. Not only are people within these contexts ill-equipped to adequately prepare for these extreme events, but they're also ill-equipped to recover from them afterwards.
So when it comes to scripture, what can we unpack or that can maybe help us reflect on this topic of the environment and our impact on it? To my mind, there's 2 particular kind of angles that we might want to take from or reflect over. The first is probably the most classic, which is the idea of stewardship. It's an idea that we find time and again in Scripture. We find it especially at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, where God entrusts the garden to their care and gives them direction over it and over the world, it would seem. And there's this idea again and again that God gives, that who we are, what we have is a gift of God. And as such, well, when someone gives you a gift, you want to take care of it, right? But often, I guess, the reality is that we don't do a great job of taking care of that gift. But the other angle, and the one that's maybe been more in my mind over this last week or so as I've been reflecting particularly over this topic and what to bring, is the idea of justice. Now I realise maybe justice isn't our first thought when it comes to the environment, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to our impact, our waste, these sort of things. But actually, it's intrinsically tied to it. So much so that I'd actually go as far as calling it a crisis of injustice that is going on around our world. Because the reality is that the consequences of climate change, they affect not just the beauty and wonder of the world that God has made, but they also affect many, many people. Often the poorest, the most vulnerable, they are the ones that feel these consequences first. And you'll have heard just at the beginning of this section a number of facts reflecting that. The impact particularly on those most vulnerable throughout our world. And while Scripture might not directly address the environment very often as a topic, it does address injustice. This is a copy of Scripture that I've had for a very long time, and one of the things that it does is it highlights every verse that talks about justice and poverty and kind of brings them to the light. And there's over 2,000 verses highlighted that talk about this. Justice and speaking up, taking action against injustice is key to who God is and is key to our understanding too. And the reality is that the consequences of our disregard for the environment are causing injustice throughout our world. And in some ways it kind of makes sense. And I'm going to jump back to a verse that I referenced earlier on that we find in the book of Numbers, which is from Numbers 35. And at the very end of the book of Numbers, it says this: I, the Lord, live among you people of Israel. So your land must be kept pure. But when a murder takes place, blood pollutes the land, and it becomes unclean. If that happens, the murderer must be put to death, so the land will be clean again. Keep murder out of Israel. A very dramatic verse, and I'm not really referencing it to reflect on the criminal justice system or anything like that, but to acknowledge something here. That verse that I quoted and so many others that we find throughout Scripture talk about this idea of justice or injustice. But I like the framing in the one of Numbers, because it talks about the idea of injustice as a pollutant on the land. That its very act is having consequence in a metaphorical sense on the land around. We see it in another place earlier on in Genesis where, with Cain and Abel, where the blood of Abel speaks out to God, where the act of injustice has this kind of metaphorical impact on the land around it. I would go so far as to suggest that our impact on the environment is no longer metaphorical, but it's a literal act of injustice. It's a consequence of us putting our own wants long and far before the needs of others, not really reflecting on the consequences of our actions, but caring about ourselves and what we want and what we can take and what we can have, and not thinking about the impact that those decisions have on so many places throughout our world. It's something intrinsic to our society of today, to take and to have, to demand for yourself, to carve out your own fortune. And there's nothing wrong with us seeking to be successful in life. But I do think we need to reflect on the cost of that success. We're called to be people of justice. A beautiful section that we find in the book of Micah when God is asked to describe what worship should be like. He speaks these famous lines in Micah 6:8, where we are called to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. That would be our focus point and our intention in life. And I would suggest that one of the biggest sources of injustice that we can cause is a disregard for our environment, a disregard for the consequences of copious amounts of plastic just piled up and kind of thrown out. I mean, think about how much trash we throw out in our everyday lives, the bags upon bags of it. Where's that going? It's either going to landfills, it's maybe in a small percentage going to recycling, it's maybe getting burnt up. Like, think of the consequences of so much of what we generate and the impact that has. And we don't maybe see it because we live in the wonder of beautiful Scotland, but there are places for whom they get stuck importing our trash, or they feel the consequences of climate change eating up at their coastlines and beyond. And at the minute, we're only seeing the foreshadow of what is to come. So to be people of justice, I would suggest we need to reflect over our own actions and the impact that they have. And the environment is one of those big ones where we have an opportunity, but where it is so easy to be lazy or just disregarding it, not aware of the impact and the consequence that it is having.
Since 1990, the world has lost 178 million hectares of forest. That's 690,000 square miles, an area the size of Libya. Over the past 3 decades, the rate of deforestation has slowed, but experts say it isn't fast enough, given the vital role that forests play in curbing global warming.
We're already seeing the devastating effects of climate change on global food supplies, increasing migration, conflict, disease, and global instability, and this will only get worse if we don't act now. Man-made climate change is the biggest environmental crisis of our time. It threatens the future of the planet that we depend on for our survival, and we're the last generation that can do something about it.
Human activity, from releasing greenhouse gases and aerosols into our atmosphere to changing the use of land, is the main driver of climate change. This has a range of impacts on our climate systems, ecosystems, and people.
We're called to act justly and to love our neighbours. God's creation is good, but the way we've damaged it is pushing people deeper into poverty. Responding to the climate emergency has to be a key part of living out our faith.
One of the challenges of a topic like the environment is that it can feel a little bit insurmountable. Like it's a global issue that needs a global solution. And we individually can feel quite small in comparison to it. I mean, yeah, it's 100% good and important for us to do what we can, but it can feel a little bit overwhelming. And also probably suggest that there's been a very good marketing job done that seems to point the direction more towards us as consumers, as individuals, to do our part, but that often skirts round the need for bigger industries and corporations to be making sure that they too are doing their part and impacting as positively as they can. Because often the scale of their impact on the environment is drastically greater and outweighs anything that we can do. But yet still, we too must reflect to consider how we can take action, how we best can respond. And although it's not perfect, there's a parable, a story that comes to mind on this topic, which we find in Luke's Gospel, the words of Jesus. And it's a story which I'm sure many of you will recognize and know. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Robbers attacked him and grabbed everything that he had. They beat him up and they ran off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, but when he saw the man, he walked by on the other side. Later, a temple helper came to the same place, but when he saw the man who had been beaten up, he also went by on the other side. A man from Samaria then came traveling along that road. He saw the man and he felt sorry for him. He went over to him, treated his wounds with olive oil and wine. He bandaged them, and he put them on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next morning, he gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins and said, "Please take care of this man. If you spend any more than this on him, I will pay you when I return." Now, I realize that this parable isn't a perfect comparison, and the environment wasn't the topic that Jesus had in mind, but there is a principle underlying here, an invitation for us on how we live our life, and it is worked out in part by our response to the environmental crisis that is happening in our world. It's one that's quite simple, where we love our neighbour, where we are aware of the needs of others, where we are aware of the consequence of our actions, and we do as best as we can with what we have. That we don't go about life like the priest, who simply saw the need and walked on by, stepped over it to get to where they wanted to go. But rather, even if it is simple and little things that we can do, we do our best to do them. From considering how we best recycle to being aware of single-use plastics that can so dominate everything we purchase, to being more cautious with our carbon footprint and taking actions to reduce it where possible in our lives. They may feel like simple and small steps, but together they build up And from there, being aware that we also have a voice that we can use. We, particularly as a middle-class kind of town of Bearsden and Torrence and Milngavie, our voice can be heard if we want it to be. Be that with companies and corporations, with what we purchase, be that with politicians to make sure changes are made and appropriately responded to. Simple things, but simple steps in the right direction. Doing what we can with what we have and being aware in our everyday lives as much as possible of the impact that we have.